This Voice of San Diego podcast is sponsored in part by Competitive Edge Research. As a nonprofit news organization, Voice of San Diego depends on our members, foundations, and sponsors like Competitive Edge Research. We are very grateful for all of our supporters, and we will recognize their support during the show. Competitive Edge Research, San Diego's premier public opinion research firm, sponsors this podcast because they like good journalism as much as they like good polling. Since 1987, Competitive Edge has helped clients see the why buried deep within the numbers. Competitive Edge designs comprehensive research studies, collects bulletproof data, and employs robust analytics so you'll understand why things are the way they are. Competitive Edge. Know what to do. And if you like Voice of San Diego's work and want to become a sponsor, contact us at development@voiceofsandiego.org.
Welcome to those of you listening on News Radio 600 Kogel. It's the Voice of San Diego on podcast. My name's Scott Lewis. I'm here. My friend, Sara Libby.
Hey.
How are you?
Doing good.
So we've got a big topic this week.
You're going to have a lot of happy people.
With a pen, President Trump again changed the fate of thousands of families with an executive order reversing his decision to enforce the law by separating children from parents at the border.
No, the border is just as tough, but we do want to keep families together. Anybody with a heart would feel very strongly about it. We don't like to see families separated. At the same time, we don't want people coming into our country illegally.
Voice of San Diego's Maya Srikrishnan has been following this since before we really knew what it was. It's a national story, but it's been a very local one as well. Jeff Sessions started it, the Attorney General, here just a few months ago with this.
I have put in place a zero-tolerance policy for illegal entry on our southwest border. If you cross the border unlawfully, then we will prosecute you. It's that simple. If you smuggle illegal aliens across our border, then we will prosecute you. If you are smuggling a child, then we will prosecute you. And that child may be separated from you as required by law.
Did you have any idea it would turn out to have this many consequences?
Yes, but it's always hard to tell all of the different consequences. I think anytime when I'm covering something, if there's a big policy change, I always try to think about the trade-offs and the unintended consequences. And it was pretty clear from when they announced this policy that some of the consequences, like the child separation, were going to be happening. And they were things that we saw on a smaller scale since last fall. So I think anyone who's been really paying attention wasn't surprised.
It's still jarring.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's been jarring. It's still really difficult to see all of the images and hear the audio and all of that. But this is something that has clearly been in the minds of the administration for a while.
We had you in a couple weeks ago to talk about the zero tolerance policy and its impact on the courts, which is still significant, and you're still following some of that. But what we're talking about is a related issue, that the impact on the courts was the charging of everybody who crossed the border illegally with the misdemeanors involved in that, and that was what was flooding the courts. And it's that act of charging them that is leading to the separation of the families, right?
For the most part, yes. So essentially, when someone is charged with a crime and they are put into criminal custody with the U.S. Marshals, they cannot have a child with them. So they were putting the parents in custody, and the children couldn't be with them, so they put them elsewhere. They were handled by the Office of Refugee Resettlement.
So what would happen before when somebody illegally crossed the border. They were caught by Border Patrol.
Yeah. And when we're talking specifically about families, so we really started, there's been unaccompanied minors and families coming to the border for a really long time. But there was a huge spike that really started in 2014. And since then, kind of figuring out how to deal with all the families has been something that not only this administration, but the past administration have tried to deal with. So in general, what was happening before the zero tolerance policy under this administration was that families would come to the border. They would usually not be criminally charged. Sometimes if the father had like 6+ deportations or other criminal history, then they would be charged on occasion. But usually if they had a child, that wasn't the case. They would just be funneled straight into immigration and deal with immigration proceedings. And what would happen is, since there are rules in place currently from a court settlement that's like dating back to the 90s, that says that children cannot be in detention for more than 20 days. And if they cannot be released to a relative or a parent or someone who can take charge of them, that they need to be in like a least restrictive setting. What would often happen is that they would just release the mother and the child on bond for them to, and they would just like have a notice to appear to come back for their immigration proceedings. Sometimes fathers were still detained, so there was still some family separation that was happening. But for the most part, at least with mothers and children, they were released.
Why can't they just, if they catch somebody who's crossed illegally, just send them back immediately? What's going on usually with those sorts of proceedings?
So what a lot of people don't understand about immigration proceedings is that they are not only a way for the government to remove you, but they're also a way for you to be able to argue for a reason that you should be able to stay. And so in the case of a lot of the Central Americans that are coming, they're claiming asylum. There's a lot of violence in their country, and their country's governments are not really capable of handling that or holding anyone accountable for that. So they are coming here and trying to seek asylum.
And so the immigration system then becomes an opportunity for them to make that plea, where then if it's accepted, they could stay here legally.
Yes.
So the asylum thing for a second. So if the secretary said this the other day about the asylum system, she said you can go to this port of entry, but it's not clear in U.S. law or even in what people understand from all these countries that is a requirement, right? Or even where those ports of entries are.
Yeah, and I think for a while, since they weren't really prosecuting a lot of asylum seekers if you didn't come through a port of entry, I guess it was maybe word of mouth or something, but people would kind of go the way that was easiest for them. And at least, in the San Ysidro port of entry, for example, there have been backups and lines for a really long time. And it's actually, and so, sometimes people would just opt to go another way.
Because they thought that all they had to do was present themselves to a Border Patrol agent or somebody and say, I'm seeking asylum. And they would get into that system of adjudicating whether that's true or something that's valid.
Yeah, and they still can. I mean, all you have to do is be on U.S. soil to be able to claim asylum. And it doesn't matter how you got there. So even now, even when people are being criminally prosecuted, after they serve their time or they go to their trial or whatnot, they still have a right to continue their asylum case afterwards.
But what the difference is that they're being charged criminally at the same time, and that is what is triggering this separation of their families.
Yeah, and that's why, this administration keeps saying we'll go to the ports of entry, because if you turn yourself in at a port of entry, you won't get criminally prosecuted. If you turn yourself in between them, then you have illegally entered the U.S. and you will be prosecuted.
We have seen a few cases, though, starting to spill out into the news in which people did go to the port of entry at San Ysidro and were still separated from their children. So there are a few of those stories that are at the center of legal cases challenging the policy, and then just a few various accounts here and there in the news of people who are detained at Otay Mesa and whose children have been sent elsewhere.
Yeah, it's been happening since 2017 and long before zero tolerance policy. And in those cases, usually if a attorney or reporter presses Customs and Border Protection, they'll say that they had a reason to question the child's safety with that adult or the biological relationship.
One interesting point that I've seen you make a couple times is that taking people's kids away and separating them from the parents has kind of had an impact in the way that the parents choose to respond to their cases or how they choose to handle their cases. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So one of the results is that oftentimes the parents will think, so basically with these cases, they're misdemeanor cases. And most of the time, if they plead guilty, they get to what's called a time served sentence, which means that right after they plead guilty, they will be released from custody, essentially. So they are only spending, a week or two in jail. And they often think that if I plead guilty or I'm deported or, and I get out of custody, I'll be reunited with my kid. And we're finding out that that's not always the case.
Yeah. And so it's the decision, it has impacts beyond just the separation itself, in that they're choosing to plead guilty, whereas they may have tried to fight it before. And if you plead guilty, of course, that impacts your claim to try and come into the country legally.
So we heard on Wednesday that the president has decided to somehow pull this back. What is the impact of what he decided?
So essentially, what the executive order says is that they will not separate children from parents, but they will try to detain families at the border together during all of these procedures. And there's several questions that come into play with that. One of them is that legal settlement that governs how long and the the conditions in which children can be detained. And it looks like laid out in that executive order is some initiative to either challenge that legally or work around it in some way. It's still unclear how that would happen. The other big question is where they would keep everyone. As of now, there are only 3 family detention centers in the entire country. And even the other ICE detention facilities that are meant for adults are pretty much all at capacity. So we're hearing that they're using, prisons and other things to be able to detain even just the adults. So that will be another thing that we need to watch really closely as it plays out.
So one thing that you've followed really closely in the court system is that it seems like very few officials who are stakeholders know how this is all going to work or have been given much guidance on how to actually carry out a lot of these policies. And that seems like it has translated very much to the family separation issue. Can you talk about what you know about what kind of information these families are given, if any? I know you covered one case in particular in San Diego in which a father's daughter was taken from him, and he'd never even heard of the place where his daughter was sent. What kind of information are these people getting about their children?
It seems like every story is kind of different. In some cases, you hear of like parents having to sign off on receipts. In other cases, it seems like the parent needs to know the child's A number, which is an alien number, which is essentially like the Social Security number that's given to unauthorized immigrants. And then so they have to figure out how to call this hotline or how to get in touch with the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And keep in mind, they are in detention and don't speak English. And they also can't receive calls. So they kind of have to figure that out, and they have to have the right information so that the caseworker of their child will actually give them that information. And so in the case that I covered, it was really difficult. This guy, he had a defense attorney, a public defense attorney who was trying to help him. And it took them, I think, a week, maybe 2 weeks to actually get in touch with the daughter's caseworker. And when I talked to them, it was maybe 2 weeks out and they still hadn't been able to schedule a phone call. And this attorney even had to get the ACLU's help to maneuver the whole system.
So the dad needed the help of an attorney who needed the help of more attorneys just to track down information on one child.
Yeah.
So I tried to go back a little bit and understand the origins of what they're trying to achieve with this. And one of the key figures that's being talked about is a presidential aide named Stephen Miller. He used to go around the country before and sort of warm the crowd up for Trump in these rallies.
We've heard the stories. We've heard the stories all across this country. Somebody shows up at the border, they get released, they kill an American in a car accident, drunk driving, murder, homicide, you name it. How many tombstones wouldn't even be in the ground today if we had just enforced our immigration laws?
There's a concept my wife taught me about the military, about malicious compliance. Like you run into people who will maliciously comply with an order to sort of make a different point, to sort of try to have a different end, to annoy somebody or show that their leadership or that the situation was bad because they would carry out the order, right? And it feels like that's kind of what the Trump administration wanted to do. They wanted to carry out the letter of the law to sort of make a broader point, to try to affect and cause this very controversy in order to shake out and create a huge, bigger crackdown of the border region. What do you think of that observation?
I think the cruelty is the point.
Right.
I don't think it's a byproduct or an accidental consequence. I think it's exactly what they were seeking and what they got.
Yeah, I'm not saying it was a side thing. I'm saying they did that they think of that as a constructive controversy, as he said, as a way, again, to trigger this sort of controversy that they can take advantage of and make laws out of.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of, if you look at the executive order, I think a lot of people who have been following this administration on immigration closely, they'll say that ultimately what they always wanted to do was to just be able to detain families so that it's cheaper and easier to deport them. And this is kind of a way to get there.
What alternatives to this approach are there other than stop doing it? We spoke with Alan Bersin. He was the U.S. attorney here, the lead federal prosecutor for the San Diego region, and he was later the acting commissioner for Customs and Border Protection.
Yeah, well, I think this is what the processing in Central America is about, and also the so-called Safe Third Country Agreement with Mexico.
So handle the problem somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Well, and just the border is not the right way, not the right place to do it, and we basically have created through government policy a situation that puts people into the hands of smugglers to go through a very dangerous journey through Mexico on the way to the border to claim asylum. And the fact that they show up at the border is a problem for those who are overly concerned about border security. And the fact of the matter is, absent a immigration court, people have been getting into the country by the thousands to await the adjudication of their asylum claim, and that's not a satisfactory result either.
One thing that's really struck me over the last week is generally, like, government is so slow moving, and just in the last week we've seen, we're rolling out this policy, and is it a policy, and now we're ending the policy, and now maybe we're moving away from zero tolerance altogether. What's your take on what it must be like to deal with things that are so in flux and things that are so chaotic and changing constantly?
Well, this is part of the problem of a policy-making process that is overly dependent on the person at the top. The usual kinds of analyses and deliberate consideration of policy and all of the implications of it and the potential consequences and results of it is not what has been taking place in Washington with regard to immigration policy, certainly, and border security. But my sense is that it doesn't really take place in the other spheres of government as well.
Let me ask you. So, if go back to the idea of dealing with it in Central America and in Mexico, we've had that idea before. Barack Obama talked about that idea, and actually there was a ton of money that went into Mexico. But my understanding is most of it went into basically fortifying and almost militarizing Mexico's approach to the border with Guatemala, and not necessarily in any of the other sort of asylum or humanitarian efforts. How do you make sure that happens?
Yeah, so Scott, that's actually not accurate. The money that went in for Merida was mostly directed to the counter-cartel fight, and the fact is that Mexico didn't militarize its border. What it did was start to enforce its immigration, and that had great benefits for the United States. But I don't think it'd be accurate to say that they've militarized their border. What they started was to do basic border enforcement, but back away from the Guatemalan border. The fact is that given the growth of the Mexican economy, we are now in a position where Mexico has a net outflow of people from the United States voluntarily and involuntarily. More people are leaving the United States and returning to Mexico than are coming from Mexico. Our immigration issue today is migration from the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, because the Mexican economy is so robust, Mexico now having the 13th largest economy in the world, that it no longer is a sending country in the way that it was for most of the last half of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st century. It's a transit country, and as its economy grows, it'll become a destination country. But the issues today in Central America, the push factors out of Central America, violence, poverty, lack of opportunity, the same factors that drove Mexicans north for so many decades, it makes Central America the focus for our immigration policy. And given the fact that Mexico is situated between Central America and the United States, is a indication that we cannot properly control our borders anymore without deep cooperation with Mexico. And that could be reflected in a safe third country agreement, be reflected in the fact that Mexicans, for their own reasons, were taking enforcement actions and apprehended more than 500,000 Central Americans in the last 3 years. They did it for their own reasons, but with great collateral benefits for the United States. To the extent that policy of cooperation and joint management, or corresponsabilidad for the management of the migration problem coming north from Central America, disappears, we can expect to have a much more serious problem than the one that we have today, where the number of people coming and being apprehended at the southwest border in the United States is the lowest number of apprehensions in almost 4 decades.
What's a safe third country provision?
The safe third country agreement, which we have with Canada, provides that if someone is in a country, a safe country, and can claim asylum, they cannot go through that country, come to the United States, and seek asylum. Under the agreement, someone claiming asylum in that manner would be returned to, in this case, Canada, where we have an agreement, and to Mexico, if we did have an agreement, would have to assert asylum in Mexico. That would be a deterrent, but in order to honor our humanitarian traditions, we'd have to also provide opportunities for people to claim asylum in their own countries as well as in Mexico. And that's where the safe zone or the in-country processing comes in. And during the Obama administration, you're right, there was something called Central American, the CAM program, which provided that people could apply for asylum in their home countries. But the process that the State Department set up was so long, and it could not compete with the smugglers who were promising to get people to the southwest border within 6 or 8 weeks, at which time people would not try to avoid the Border Patrol, but rather seek them out, claim asylum, and then people would be paroled into the United States. Because of the backlog in the immigration court system, the hearings for adjudicating asylum claims were being pushed 2, 3, 4 years in the future. So that when faced with a situation of either applying in Guatemala or Honduras or El Salvador and waiting for 2, 3 years to have your claim adjudicated, smugglers were offering to get people to the border and to get them into the country. And that's in fact what was happening because of the weakness of policy in the Obama administration with regard to the asylum process.
This Voice of San Diego podcast is sponsored in part by the North County Philanthropy Council. As a nonprofit news organization, Voice of San Diego depends on our members, foundations, and sponsors. North County Philanthropy Council presents High Impact Leadership. Mentoring and coaching are today's trends for tomorrow's leaders workshop and luncheon on Friday, June 29th at Sheraton Carlsbad. Be motivated by inspiring leaders from SDG&E, Unbuttoned Innovation, Nordson Corporation Foundation, and Mission Edge as they share their approaches to high-impact leadership at the event. For more info, contact Sandra at ncphilanthropy.org or go to www.ncphilanthropy.org. And if you like Voice of San Diego's work and want to become a sponsor too, contact us at development@voiceofsandiego.org.
We're back. So Andy Keats, you might have noticed, has been not speaking.
Right. Not even a little bit.
Because he is not here. He's on one of his East Coast bougie tours.
Yeah, I feel like he vaguely objects to the fact that we joke about like, oh, are you going to Cape Cod? Are you going to Martha's Vineyard? And I literally was like, oh, where are you going on your vacation? Oh, Cape Cod. And
oh, I love Andy. He's okay. You know, I'm in a good mood on Thursday, and I feel bad that he's not here to see it. Because usually he and I fight on Thursdays.
That's, well, among other days.
So maybe I'll text him a picture. What do you call those where you're like moving in the picture, like a quick picture, like a boomerang thing or something?
Oh, is this a trap?
Yeah.
Is this a GIF versus GIF setup?
Oh, I don't know. No, because there's GIF.
Uh-huh.
No, what do you say?
I say GIF.
Right. Come on. That's not even a question. Okay. I understand the logic why people say GIF because it's GIF and you would say GIF.
It's wrong.
But it's wrong.
It's bad.
Yeah. But I'm going to send him. Can you teach me how to do boomerangs, Kinsey?
We'll enlist a young.
Let's get one of the youngs in the office. So before he left, Andy did do a piece for us, and it's kind of bananas. I don't know if it's wrong or right or good or bad. It's just really interesting. Let's get through this. So throughout downtown, buses wait on the side of streets next to porta potties while their drivers do their business. For years, the San Diego Association of Governments has wanted to fix this and secure a lot downtown where everybody can go, all the buses and all the people that need to go to the bathroom. The board has settled on land south of Little Italy to make this happen. So it's like A and B and Union and State, right? Something like that.
Yeah, right by us.
Yeah, exactly. SANDAG leaders figure that since they're already getting that land for the buses, they may as well just build a tower. And since they're already building the tower, they might as well put SANDAG's headquarters there. And since the SANDAG's headquarters won't need that whole space, they might as well rent the rest of it to others. And the project's cost for this lot has now ballooned to $112 million. Okay, there's just one little problem. The land's owners don't want to sell it.
That's a problem.
So SANDAG would have to and will be considering whether to seize it with eminent domain. So by the time you hear this podcast, they've probably made the vote about whether they want to do this or not. We got some commentaries about this. Richard Bailey, the mayor of Coronado, basically said, like, you can still have porta potties, right?
Yeah. He had kind of 2 points. One, there are much easier and cheaper ways to solve this problem of the idling buses and the drivers who are on their brakes. And his other point, which I thought was really fascinating, was that, like, buses will soon be, like, automated, and presumably there will be, like, robot buses driving us around, and we won't need...
Robots don't pee.
Exactly.
Unless they're bad robots.
That was a side of this debate I didn't see coming.
So now, look, the logic, of course, is, like, SANDAG is an entity with employees that has to rent office space. I even wrote about how much they spent for their office space this last time they leased it. And now they're, it makes sense. They're going to be probably around as an entity for another 100 years or something. So maybe they should buy a building. And if you're going to buy a building, you might as well make the most of it and maybe make some money and replant. That's the argument for it, right? That's what Georgette Gomez says, correct?
I think so.
And so a lot of people, Georgette Gomez, Todd Gloria, the assemblyman, and Serge Dedina, mayor of Tijuana, they all say this is that good deal. So
IB.
What did I
Which
say?
is close to Tijuana.
Oh, yeah, sorry. No offense to either. So that's a interesting debate. I thought he did a good job of sort of just spelling out both arguments and the costs involved. Again, $112 million. This is money that comes from SANDAG's Transnet tax.
Yeah. And another argument against it is that, like, obviously there's this need for a space for the buses and even a headquarters, presumably. But then you get into, like, all this other office space and you're going to be leasing it out, and maybe it's retail. And is that really, like, such an urgent public need that you would have to take this really drastic step of eminent domain?
Right. And so I thought was one of the interesting parts, one of the owners is the San Diego County Bar Association, right? They have a $12 million stake or something in the land. And so they're a bunch of lawyers. That's quite a group to turn.
They want their own headquarters. So.
Right. So fascinating deal. Again, obviously, if you're tuned into the Voice of San Diego, you'll hear how the vote turns out. Another interesting voter issue. So last week, the Registrar of Voters, Michael Vu, told a campaign it had insufficient signatures to get a measure on the November ballot. The November ballot is going to be bananas.
Mm-hmm. Bananas Part 2.
Bananas Part 2. This campaign is called the Full Voter Participation Campaign. So the measure, it's kind of like Measure K from 2016 in the city of San Diego. The measure would force all county elections to go to a November runoff, no matter how well a candidate does in the primary. For instance, right now, if a candidate gets more than 50% of the vote in a primary, she wins the election. So the district attorney, for example, won outright in this last election. And if this were to pass in 2022, she would have to go to a runoff no matter what.
Yeah.
And of course, that is the theory. There's sort of two angles to it. One is that more people vote in November, and thus more people should know. They just calling it a primary makes it seem like you're not going to have the final decision then.
Right.
And then the second, of course, thing we should acknowledge is that this would help Democrats pretty obviously. The campaign, though, is not giving up in Sacramento. Assemblyman Todd Gloria rushed through a bill this week that's now sitting on the governor's desk that would basically let them have fewer signatures to qualify this ballot. So he had written his original law to say that the signatures have to be 10% of all county electors, all voters in the county. It's about 160,000 people.
It's a lot of people. A lot of signatures.
They turned in about 100,000 signatures based on the idea that it was only 60,000 signatures needed, which is 10% of the last vote of people who voted.
Right. That's a big difference.
Yes. So their argument is that that's the way most things are, and that's the way we thought this legislation was written. And so Todd Gloria says, we're just trying to clarify that that's what we intended. And so they're hoping that the governor will sign this and that Vu has 30 days before he makes his ultimate decision or whatever on whether to throw out this initiative, and that he'll see the governor's signature on this new law. He'll reread the law, count the votes or count the petitions, and put the measure on the ballot.
Yeah, it's wild.
There's a lot going on there.
There's a lot. I went back and listened to the hearings for when this bill was being argued in the legislature, and it was really fascinating. They didn't deal at all with this issue of the 10%. They focused only on, are runoffs good? Are they bad? Is this strictly a ploy for Democrats? And San Diego is a charter county. And so that's like the heart of the debate of why they supposedly need this law.
Right.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. Did you understand why they did? Because I understand when the county is just an arm of the state.
Yeah. So their argument for why they need a law is that when you're not a charter county, you just go by all the state laws. And it's less clear when you're a charter county whether you have the ability to set your own election reforms or measures that are different from the state. And so they said we need something specifically spelling out our ability to do this.
So to be clear, in this thing to specifically spell out their ability to do that, they now say they screwed up.
Yes, exactly.
Because they're like, well, it's a mistake or we need to clarify, but it doesn't seem like it's unclear at all. The line says 10% of all electors
voters,
in the county.
All registered voters.
So the group mostly behind it, there's a few supporters, obviously, is the County Employees Union, the SEIU, Service Employees International Union. They were at first very accusatory about Vu, that he was basically part of a hardball politics of the Republican majority, the Republican unanimity on the County Board of Supervisors. But then he made remarks in the UT a couple of days after I broke the story on, or we and Rai Rivard broke the story on Friday or Saturday morning, because he then said, well, look, if the governor signs this, I'll look at it and see what it changes.
Yeah. They were part of the group that wanted the law to begin with. The county opposed the law from the start. So it's like the same battle playing out over again.
Right. So stay tuned for that. Again, we'll do an update in the politics report, but another reason to sign up for that wonderful product on Saturdays, politics report, I usually do with my friend Andy Keats and some contributors. Sarah's contributed a few things.
Made an appearance.
Yeah. So I got to do it again myself this week. I'm interested. So tomorrow we have this Friday, if you're listening on Friday, we'll be in the middle of a hearing at the Superior Court. The school district and us will be arguing about whether the school district can delete about 600 million emails.
That's right.
Permanently or not. We're trying to stop them from doing that. Basically, the district has argued that this individual employees themselves are the best to decide whether these are public records or not that they're deleting, and that we just have to deal with that. Yeah,
it's kind of scary to think that people, I'm not sure what kind of training they have or is going to be made available to them about what constitutes a public record and, what their motivations might be in preserving or deleting certain things.
What's clear, though, is if they want to get rid of an email, the school district wants to help them do that, and we'll do that maybe even Friday afternoon, the moment this hearing's done. So we're all on edge. Be very interesting. We'll also have an update about that. Okay. Another story we wanted to highlight this week was Rai Rivard's profile of Maureen Stapleton. Pretty good, right?
Oh, yeah. So, I think a lot of people, even people who follow this stuff closely, learned a lot of new stuff.
So she's been 22 years, right? The general manager of the San Diego County Water Authority. So again, just some geography here. So, every city or almost every city has a water district. Basically, a bunch of people got together and said, we're going to buy water, and that's a water district. There's a bunch of water districts that are part of the Water Authority. The Water Authority is itself part of a bunch of districts that are part of the Metropolitan Water District. And those agencies all combine and cooperate and fight to bring us our water, which is important. And she's been in charge 22 years.
Yeah. So one thing that Rai really drove home in this profile is the fact that she has been really instrumental in helping San Diego secure its own sources of water. So that was a big problem. Like in the early 90s, people freaked out after a drought when they kind of realized that Metropolitan controlled all of our water and we had no say pretty much. And so That's why you've seen things like the desalination plant and deals with Imperial to buy water that is just belonging to San Diego.
Yeah, so that was the first major thing I ever covered when I moved to San Diego was this so-called quantification settlement agreement. They basically kind of put a cap on how much water California had and then divvied it up. And we ended up purchasing water from the farmers in Imperial Valley, paid them to not farm, basically. Rye had a great story a few months ago about where that money was going, what it was buying. And she was the architect of a lot of that work, and she's got a lot of big things done. But it's an interesting time for her. So this battle with Metropolitan Water District, one of the big fights is how much the Met, as it's called, charges us to deliver that water, the so-called wheeling rate from the Imperial District. And we've been suing them, San Diego, in fact, and then they've been fighting back, and there's been these PR wars. And then there was this really bizarre incident that Rye first reported on, where Maureen Stapleton is accused by a board member of the San Diego County Water Authority of having accused him in a sort of drunken night of discussion of having an affair with one of the Metropolitan employees.
Yeah, so they've had this long-running feud with Metropolitan, and it's taken a lot of really bizarre turns, and a lot of people say it's gotten really ugly and personal, and this was one of the ways Rye found that happened. And then he reported that incident a few weeks ago, a couple months ago maybe, and in this story he actually had some people go on the record for the first time about what they say they also believe was personal attacks orchestrated by the Water Authority because they worked for or were working with Metropolitan.
Yeah, so and it's pretty clear she was brought in a way and was kind of an architect of the brawl, right? Like this is San Diego kind of realized in the 90s, like, we need to be more independent. We need to have our own sources of water, like you described. And with that came this kind of just battle.
Yeah, one thing I thought was really interesting was he talked to somebody who actually interviewed for the job before it went to Maureen, and this woman said she was so uncomfortable with, they clearly wanted someone to pick fights with Metropolitan. That's what they were looking for. And she said, well, that's not really what I want to do in this role. So she bowed out.
Right. There was also an interesting part where a couple farmers were talking about that Metropolitan itself wanted to make the deal with the farmers and was kind of holding out for a better deal when San Diego went in and made the deal themselves. And they're like, why couldn't we have done that a better way? It's just a fascinating history of San Diego water. Basically, this region and everything we care about this region as far as economic activity, infrastructure, the universities.
Our way of life.
Like our life is dependent on these entities bringing us water. And the fights and the interesting discussions they go on to make that happen are worth following. So you can see all of those things and other of our great investigative work at voicesandiego.org. What do you got planned this weekend? Do anything cool?
Oh man, just relaxing with this baby.
Yeah, you get the babies, and then on Monday it's kind of like
It's like a weird break. Going to work.
Monday is like the relaxing day.
Yeah, he's like perfect age though, because he's like peak cuteness, but like not quite big enough to destroy things.
I gotta see him again.
Yeah.
All right. Have a good day.
Thanks for listening to the Voice of San Diego podcast. This show is part of the Voice of San Diego podcast network. Visit voiceofsandiego.org/podcast to learn more about our education podcast, Good Schools for All, and our partner shows Beer Talk Radio, the Kept Faith Sports Podcast, and the rest of the shows in the network of local podcasts.